The winter wind howled across the frozen tundra of Finnmark, while ribbons of green aurora swept like fire across the night sky. Inside a small goati, a traditional Sami hut of wood and reindeer hide, young Anna Ravna wrapped herself in a fur cloak, guarding her small herd against the storm's bite. Then came the sound, soft scratching against the wall, followed by trembling whines that pierced the silence like a plea. When she unlatched the door, 2 ember eyes glowed in the snowdrift. They were not dogs, but 2 starving wolves, desperate enough to knock for shelter. The wind ran its fingers across the tundra like a restless spirit, combing snow into long pale dunes that glowed under the aurora. Green light walked the sky in silent curtains. Inside her goati, Anarafna fed another stick to the stove and listened to the iron tick as it settled. Heat gathered low, pulling around her boots and the hem of her reindeer fur skirt before it rose to the smoke hole and vanished into the night. She had counted the herd by headlamp, at dusk dark humps pressed together against the weather in the birch scrub, their breath rising in white knots. The lead doe had a new nick on her ear from a snag of wire near the fence. An had trimmed it away with her luku and pocketed the sharp twist, a small talisman against carelessness. She told herself everything was in order. She told herself she understood this winter, that she had known harsher. The wind changed, and the goati sighed. The rawhide that stitched the roof to its ribs creaked. The door skin drummed softly on its frame. Her grandmother's beadwork glinted where it hung from a peg. The kettle whispered. One more night, she thought. One more night, and the forecast promised a blue day, the kind that made you believe in spring even when the thermometer bit your skin. The first sound was easy to mishear, a scuff, a soft scrape like a branch dragged by the storm. Unpaused, hand still on the kettle handle. The second sound did not belong to weather. Something touched the doorskin from the outside, slow, deliberate, then the quietest, broken little whine. Her scalp prickled. She put the kettle down without letting it clack and moved to the door. The luku lay on the shelf where she always kept it. She slipped it into its sheath at her belt. She took the iron poker from beside the stove because her father would have, because there was no sense pretending fear away. Then she breathed once, twice, and lifted the door flap. Snow swirled into the gap. The aurora threw a strange light through the moving air, a sickle of green and a seam of violet. For a heartbeat, the doorway held nothing but storm. Then 2 eyes opened in the drift, steady and closed as lanterns. They were set in a narrow face rimed with frost. The wolf stood with its shoulders hunched, ribs showing where the fur had gone thin. Another shape moved behind it, a second wolf with a darker mask and a small quick flicker of pain in the way it held one forepaw. An tasted metal. Her hand tightened on the poker until her fingers ached. Every story she had ever been told rushed forward at once. Wolves running the fence in hard winters. Wolves pulling calves when men slept. Wolves with snow on their whiskers and blood on the snow. You do not speak to them. You do not invite them near. You haste them back to the edge of the world where they belong. The first wolf took 1 step, then sank a little as the drift shifted. It did not growl. Its ears were not forward like a challenge, but held back, neither flat with fear nor high with aggression listening. The second wolf lifted his paw and set it down and lifted it again, a small helpless motion that cracked something in her. Go, she said, voice low and firm, the word lost in wind as soon as it left her mouth. The first wolf blinked, its breath fogged. Snowflakes clung to its lashes. Go, she said again, louder, from the safer courage that comes with sound. She stamped once on the threshold. The first wolf flinched, not back, but sideways. As a dog will when a bowl is set too close to a boot. The second wolf shivered so hard his teeth chattered. It made a noise thin, embarrassed, not for her but for the cold, and tucked its nose toward his chest. The smell reached her then, not of blood, not even the strong musk of carnivore, but the blunted neutral smell of wet fur and old frost. Anne thought of the herd, of the fence repaired with numb hands, of the men in town who would cluck their tongues and call her foolish if they ever heard this. Then she thought of her grandmother telling her to listen to the land first and people second. She pulled the door skin wider. "Only for warmth," she said. Ridiculous for speaking Sami to wolves, more ridiculous for believing everything living understood tone. Only for warmth, and only if you remember who lives here. The wind threw a handful of snow into her face, as if to scold her. The first wolf stepped past her in a curve, eyes sideways, not brushing her legs, not forcing. The second hesitated, its paw hovering out of the drift. Then it limped forward with a small sound that made her stomach flip. They moved like tired ghosts inside the ring of her home, bold and careful at once. Her body was awake to every angle. She shut the door and stood with her back against it for a breath, measuring the room. The goati was not large. Stove, low bed, bench, pegs, a chest for mending, a heap of wood, a rack with nets and snares she used only for fish now. She saw the paths the wolves could take if they lunged stove to wall to bed to her, and pictured the lack of lunging with equal clarity. Their heads were low, their tails hung neutral. They froze when the stove ticked, and then their noses went up like small periscopes toward the dry heat. Both swallowed in unison. Anne let out the breath she was holding. "All right," she said. "All right." She put the poker back by the stove within reach. She set a wooden bucket near the door, then thought better of it and moved it to a corner where her shadow covered it, as if that would make the water safer. She took 2 strips of dried meat from a cloth-back reindeer, smoked and hard as old bark, and laid them on the floor 2 arms' lengths from herself. The scent unfurled to meet the wolves. Both heads turned. The larger one, no. The one that was not limping glanced at her before it moved. A glance like a question asked, and answered in the same breath. They ate the way starved things eat, when they have not yet remembered that food is real, fast, without noise, careful not to let their teeth click on the wood. She set 2 more strips down and pulled her knees up on the bench, making herself small. It felt like a ceremony, and perhaps it was. She had never done this before. She had driven wolves from the fence with firecrackers and a yipping coal. She had never invited them into the circle of her heat, into the light where she braided spruce roots and mended straps and wrote lists on the back of seed catalogs. When the meat was gone, the wolves lifted their heads together. The limp was more pronounced now that the animal stood on a hard surface with no drift to round its stance. Between the pads, a dark crack, a chapped line, perhaps frozen, perhaps worse. The wolf licked the place once and flinched. "Don't," Anne says softly, and could have laughed at herself. What would they make of "don't"? What would any wild thing make of any human word? She stirred the stove, slow so the iron would not ring like a bell and spook them. Steam curled from the kettle when she lifted its lid. The smell of tea smoked spruce needles. A little juniper made a thin promise. She thought of salves and fats and old recipes, bear grease, none in the chest, reindeer, tallow some, wrapped in cloth, spruce resin, hardened lumps in a jar. A pinch of powdered angelica root her grandmother used to press into a wound to keep it sweet. Those belonged to the box she kept under the bed. She pictured lifting the lid, the tiny metallic noise the latch made. Both wolves rising like shadows, and deciding her hands were not welcome. Tomorrow, she told herself, In light, the wolves were looking at the stove as if it were some living animal that breathed heat and burned wood. Their ears twitched with each new crack of sap. The one with the sore paw curled its toes under, not touching the floor, then gave up and lay down with its legs folded like a colt, careful and awkward. The other moved so it lay in front like an older sibling between it and the door. Anne drank too hot tea and burned her tongue. The old taste, the taste of cured wood and iron and needles boiled too long, steadied her. She kept her face turned a little away, and her hands where the wolves could see them. Her heart steadied too, not because this made sense now, but because nothing dangerous had happened in a long minute, and then another. Wind shoved at the gowati with a broad cold palm. Snow hissed along the skin. The stove tick-ticked. Somewhere outside, a tree groaned where ice had burdened it. Anne's shoulders released their hunch by degrees. She set another log on, slow, and watched resin catch and burn blue. "You are not gods," she told the wolves, "because people sometimes forgot and made monsters from animals or saints. You are not devils. You are just cold." The wolves blinked. The one nearest the stove let its jaw loosen, tongue showing for a second like a child caught in a nap between worlds. She thought of what the men in Kara's jug would say if they could see this. Irresponsible, that would be one word. Soft, another. There were stories, too, from her own family, told in that voice people use when they are trying to protect you with fear. Once, when your father was small, and then the image you were supposed to keep like a nail in your pocket. And yet no one had been here when she stood in the drift up to her thighs last winter and pulled a hindered doe's leg from a tangle of wire while the animal collapsed against her chest like a sack of wet clothes and did not kick her teeth. Out, trusting as far as deer can. No one had been here when the fox came thin as a whip in September and took her bread because she had left it outside and she went without rather than shoot it. People told simpler stories than the land did. The limp wolf shifted and whined a small sound, less painful than uncertain. Anne swung her feet to the floor and the wolves froze as if she had become an outline cut from paper. Slowly, she reached sideways for an old wool blanket on the peg. She shook it out once, letting them hear and see the motion, then folded it twice and slid it onto the floor near the stove, half between them and the fire. If they ignored it, she would not be offended. If they tore it, she would mend. The wolves smelled it and, after a long, slow time in which they did not quite breathe, the sore one slid onto it with a sigh that sounded so human. Her skin prickled again. "Good," she murmured. "Good." She ate a heel of bread, then remembered to break another piece small and leave it near the door. It was not for the wolves. A mouse had been bold last week, and bold mice turned to bothersome mice. This would keep it away from the stove. The logic satisfied a part of her mind that wanted rules and order. Another part watched the long muscles under the wolf's fur and did not think of mice at all. A long hour went that way. She mended a strap that had split where it met a brass ring. The wolves dozed and did not doze in the way of wild things that have always slept ready to run. Once the not limping one's paws twitched as if running over shallow snow in a dream. Once they both lifted their heads at the same instant, ears toward the door, and Anne felt the hair on her arms lift as if the air itself had turned to look with them. She almost asked, "What do you hear?" as if they would point with their noses and tell her. Instead, she set her mending aside and listened. The wind was lower now, as if the night had exerted itself and was resting. In that quieter engine, she could sort the other noises. The creak of the rawhide, the breath of the wolves. In and out, not matched, and yet it felt matched. Somewhere, far as a remembered song, a sound like a voice caught and lost. She stood, and the wolves watched her with eyes that reflected more light than seemed possible. She blew out the lamp and let the aurora's thin spill be enough. The goati shrank and softened, all edges turning round. She double-checked the latch on her chest, not because she thought wolves might work it with clever teeth, but because the ritual made sleep feel less like surrender and more like a decision. She set her luku and the poker near the stove. "Only warmth," she said again, not sure if she meant the promise or the rule. She lay down without pulling the heavy cover fully over her, boots still on in case. In case of what? She did not name. The stove's heartbeat made the thin metal quiver. The wolf's breath measured the dark. She let her eyes half close, then open again at the smallest rasp, then finally soften, because the body that has watched long enough will take its own mercy. Sometime deep in the night, she woke to silence so deep it pressed on her ears. The aurora had paled to a faint gauze. Frost had written fernwork across the inside of the smoke hole. The stove was at its last red. She sat up, and both wolves lifted their heads as one, not with the startled stiffness of alarm, but with attention tuned to something just past the skin of the goati. They were listening not to her, not to the stove, not to the scurry of a mouse or the tick of cooling iron. They were listening outward. The not-limping wolf's ears pricked and turned. The sore one made a sound low in his throat that did not belong to hunger or pain. It belonged to recognition. An held still. The silence outside had a shape now, the way fog has a shape you only understand once you're inside it. In that shape, she caught a thread of sound so thin it could have been a trick of memory, a distant, hesitant note that lifted and fell and lifted again. It was a howl, too far away for any human voice to reach, close enough to pull at the belly of any animal that had ever needed a family. The wolf's eyes flashed toward the door. Anna's own breath came back to her in a small cloud. "We are not alone," she whispered to no one, to the stove, to the aurora dying, to the wolves who were already on their feet without standing, balanced and waiting in the narrow river of light between her and whatever waited outside. And because there was nothing to do at that hour but what the hour allowed, she stood, fed the stove a log, and listened to the world beyond the wall answer itself. Morning came in shades of blue, the kind of light that never fully committed to day. Anne woke with the taste of smoke on her tongue and the memory of a howl still curling through her mind. For a heartbeat, she thought she had dreamed it. But the two wolves were no dream. They lay curled near the stove, their breaths sending faint plumes into the cool air of the goati. The injured one stirred first, lifting its head, ears twitching at the faint crackle of embers. The larger wolf remained stretched long across the floorboards like a barrier between sibling and door. Anne's first impulse was to make noise, to remind herself she was mistress here, not a guest in her own home. But something held her. Instead, she moved slowly, gathering dry spruce twigs and laying them into the stove. Sparks leapt, orange flares against the cold gloom. The wolves flinched at the sound of iron scraping, but they did not rise. Her grandmother's words came back like an echo. If a creature comes to your hearth, it has already offered you its trust. Break that, and you break something larger than you. Trust. That word felt absurd when applied to wolves. Yet here they were, ribs sharp as blades beneath their fur, watching her every move not with the fire of predators but the hollow hunger of survivors. She tore strips of dried reindeer meat into smaller pieces, tossed them a little farther from her feet than last night. The limp wolf sniffed first. It hobbled forward, lowered its head, and took a strip. The larger one followed, never eating before the other, but always close enough to guard. Anna sat on her bench, hands folded in her lap. She wanted to reach for her grandmother's box of remedies, fat, resin, herbs, but caution pinned her still. Could she touch that wounded paw without sparking teeth? She studied the swelling, the awkward way the wolf shifted weight from it. Infection would come if she did nothing. Yet to help was to gamble her life. She whispered, not knowing why, "You'll die if I leave it." The limping wolf's ears twitched, as if tone mattered more than meaning. A gust rattled the rawhide wall, and the wolves jerked their heads toward the sound. Their alertness was contagious. Annie's own heart sped up. She heard nothing beyond the wind, but the memory of last night's distant howl slid back into her chest like ice. Were they listening for family? For a pack that had lost them or abandoned them? The thought unsettled her. She had heard the stories. Lone wolves did not last long in winters like this. But 3 wolves, if the call had been real, meant a fragment of something larger, still clung to life out in the tundra. Her gaze dropped again to the injured paw. She couldn't wait. She set water to boil, mixing it with spruce resin until the sharp scent filled the hut. The wolves tracked her every step, ears flicking, eyes unblinking. Slowly, she crouched, extending the cloth she had dipped in warm resin water. The larger wolf bristled, its lips peeled back in the barest whisper of a growl, warning but not yet threat. Anne froze, breath caught. She lowered her gaze, not submissive, but not challenging, and murmured the way she would to a restless reindeer calf. "I will not hurt her." Her voice shook, but steadiness lived underneath. She waited. Seconds stretched thin as wire. Then the larger wolf lowered its head, a silent permission granted not by reason but by weariness. Anna inched closer to the injured wolf. Its paw trembled when she touched the cloth to the cracked pad. It gave a soft whine pang, not anger. She whispered again, steady, working resin into the wound, wrapping it with strips of cloth torn from an old undershirt. The wolf flinched, but it did not strike. When it was done, Anne leaned back, hard hammering in her ribs. The larger wolf sniffed the bandage, gave a low rumble, and then shockingly licked the cloth once, as if to seal the pact. Anna exhaled so deeply her chest ached. The room felt different after that, as though a line had been crossed, not into danger, but into something fragile and unspoken. She poured herself tea and sipped, letting silence do its work. The wolves curled together near the stove. Their eyes never left her, but their lids grew heavy. Outside, the storm had eased, and with the silence came a sense of being watched. Anne pushed aside the doorskin. Pale light flooded the tundra. No tracks marked the snow near the goatee. Yet when she strained her ears, she thought she heard, just faintly, the echo of another howl carried on the edge of the wind. She shivered, pulling the door closed. Inside, the wolves stirred, ears pricked, as if they too had heard the call. Anna whispered to herself, "They're not done with this world yet." The thought was not frightening. It was a promise. The day never quite brightened. The blue of morning thickened into pewter, and the pewter settled like a lid. Anne banked the stove and stepped outside with a pail, letting the cold slap her fully awake. The snow around the goatee lay smooth, except for her own prints from the night before, and a few faint bird tracks stitched like a careless seam. No new sign, no shadow at the birch line, only the hush of a world between storms. When she turned back toward the door, a figure detached itself from the sparse trees and raised one hand. He moved slowly, palms open to show he carried no gun. He wore a snow-crusted anorak, a knit cap pulled low, a face reddened by cold and weather, and a pack with hard corners that suggested instruments, not provisions. The strap across his chest held a small box with a telescoping antenna folded down. Bore eat it, he called Sami. For good morning then, in careful Norwegian. I'm Jonas Kvale, from Tromsø. I'm sorry to come unannounced. Anne's fingers tightened on the pail's handle. Behind the door skin, 2 wolves lifted their heads in unison. She kept her body between Jonas and the threshold without thinking, and did not smile. What do you want? Wolves, he said simply, and winced at his own bluntness. To find them, to help them, if I can. Something like weariness flickered across his features, not theatrical, not coaxing. He tapped the small box on his strap. We've been tracking a small pack across the Finnmarksvidda, 2 collared last spring. We lost signal in the last storm. I found weak sign on the ridge, and prints that came near your place. He gestured to the untouched snow, to the emptiness. I hoped they survived somewhere. An said nothing. The wind ruffled his cap. The antenna clicked softly as he shifted. He kept his eyes on hers and not on the door. Good. She tilted her chin toward the birch scrub. No tracks this morning, she said. His breath fogged once, twice. May I? He broke off when the rawhide at the door rustled, and 2 silhouettes cut the pale from within. He saw them then. It changed the shape of his face. He did not reach for the antenna. He did not step forward. He only lowered his head fractionally, a courtesy that made something in her unclench. They're alive, he said, barely more than breath. God. They're not gods, An said, and the corner of his mouth answered with the ghost of a smile, as if they had both told the same joke to the same stern aunt. May I come in? I brought salves, booties. He lifted his pack, as if the weight explained his presence as much as any words. She considered the wolves. Their ears were forward, their bodies not rigid but tall with attention. The injured one shifted its wrapped paw and made a small rough sound deep in his throat. The bandage was already stained with a pale rosette of resin and warmth. Anne stepped aside. Only calm, she said. Only slow. I have no other speeds left, Jonas said, and ducked in, closing the weather behind him with all the delicacy of a man entering a church he had not paid to repair. The Goati breathed heat at him. He stood just inside until the wolves decided his outline belonged. When he knelt, he turned the side of his body toward them, not the square of his chest. He set his pack down, opened it without zippers rasping. All his closures were cloth and toggles, and took out a flat tin and a roll of gauze and something that looked like a set of tiny leather socks. Who bandaged her? He asked softly, eyes not leaving the wolves. I did. An hated how much her voice wanted to sound defensive and made it sound ordinary instead. It's good work, he said at once. Resin smart. Keeps the wound sweet. May I? He looked at the wolves and stopped. The larger one had raised its head and thinned its lips until the white showed. Not yet, he amended. Later, when she says so. He took out a different tin and set it near the stove to soften. Lanolin and a little zinc, he murmured, half to himself, if she lets it. He brought out the box with the antenna last. He didn't turn it on immediately. He let the wolves smell its cold metal, let them decide it did not bite. Then he extended the antenna in slow clicks and turned the dial with a careful finger. The device woke with a dry hiss. Jonas tuned through the static, searching with small movements that made his breath shallow. The hiss dithered into a faint, intermittent chirp. There, he said, as tenderness, as if he'd heard a child say a name for the first time. That's one of the callers, very weak, far. He turned the dial again. Another channel hissed, and nothing more. The second is off, or dead, or gone, he said, and his mouth tightened around the words as if they tasted wrong. He flicked back to the faint chirp, lifted the antenna, lowered it, swept it slightly. Signal strengthens toward the lake, drops to nothing toward the ridge. It's moving, slowly or blown by wind in trees. Could be hung on a branch. He paused and shook his head. Number collars don't come off that easily, not both. The larger wolf stood, then sat again, then stood. The injured one shifted on the blanket, whiskers quivering. Their ears tilted toward the door, and then toward the little box, and then toward each other, trying to triangulate the world's intention. Jonas set the receiver down as if setting down a cup of hot liquid that might spill. He looked at the bandage again, then at An-Nei's hands, then at the stove, at the life that had made this space. "How did they get in?" he asked finally, voice gentle to a thread. "They knocked," Anna said. The corner of his mouth moved again. Not quite a smile. Relief. "I believe you," he said. He did. She saw it. The ease of being believed passed through her like a warm draft. She nodded at the box. "The faint one. How far?" 3, maybe 4 kilometers, he said. "The lake's edge. The wind can make a liar of the needle, but the lake." He touched the antenna to the door skin, listening to the chirp change. "There's a squall coming by afternoon. If we go now." "We?" She raised an eyebrow. "I won't find the safe places like you will," he said simply. "I'll walk where the ice is loudest. You'll hear what I miss." She set her jaw to refuse, the way she would if a stranger offered to carry her pack. Then she saw the way the wolves' bodies leaned not toward him, not toward the stove, but toward the door, toward the faint singing from the box, toward a place their feet knew and their noses remembered. She tied her hair back with a strip of red cloth. 10 minutes, she said. "You carry the heavy." They worked without rush, and yet everything they did had the efficiency of people who know storms by more than forecast. Anne strapped a small wooden sled, the old pulk her father had used for hauling game, behind her snow scooter. She laced a reindeer hide tarp over the pulk's ribs and tossed in blankets, the med tin, a coil of rope, a pair of wire cutters, and her luku. Jonas moved like a man who carried his home on his back, and perhaps he did. He added a thermal mat, a foil blanket, a small first aid kit that looked too clean for the places it might go, and a thermos that clinked like there was glass inside. Inside the goati, the wolves watched as if memorizing a ritual. The injured one licked at the bandage. The other pressed shoulder to shoulder with her, as if to remind her that pressure meant presence, not pain. Un set a basin of water by the stove. Then, on second thought, pushed it farther back so it would stay cool longer. She scattered a handful of dried meat crumbs on the blanket, not enough to make them fight, enough to make staying feel like a thing she had offered, not a thing she had demanded. She unlatched the small interior hatch she sometimes used to let smoke out faster, and left it ajar, in case heat swelled and the air grew tight. She hesitated, then placed her grandmother's prayer beads on the peg by the door, the ones with the tin discs that chimed when you moved them. For luck. For whatever luck meant when you were dealing with weather and wolves. "You'll stay," she told them. Ridiculous and necessary. The larger wolf lowered its head. The injured one tapped the bandaged paw against the blanket once, as if testing the word. They left with the receiver's faint beeping counting out a heartbeat too far away to help. The world outside had a taste of iron. Sky and snow pressed against each other, like two halves of a vise. The birches wore hoarfrost on every twig, a delicate skin that would shatter with the first hard breath of wind. Jonas sat behind Anna on the scooter with the antenna canted over his shoulder like a slender mast. The pulk hissed behind them with the sound of silk torn very slowly. The beeping grew stronger when they crested the first low rise, then fainter in the shallow bowl beyond, then strong again at the edge of the little lake where ptarmigan tracks stitched the snow in charming indecision. Jonas raised the antenna and turned it. The beeps quickened toward the far shore, toward a black seam where the ice had heaved and refrozen, toward a stand of dwarf birch so laden with rime they looked like a row of old men bent under grief. An throttled back and listened. I spoke in groans and whispers. Today's song was old, not dangerous. The recent cold had thickened the skin and quieted the cracks. She angled across at the narrowest point, where snow had drifted to make a white road. The scooter's track rasped. On the far bank, a raven flapped up, croaked once, and settled again to watch, as ravens always watched, hungry for mistake and story. The beeping steadied, a little stronger now, a little more sure. Jonas's breath warmed the back of her hood in short, controlled puffs. "Here," he said, when the needle sang. He tapped her shoulder and pointed with his chin. Past the birch, down. The birch gave way to a low gully where wind had spooned the snow into long, elegant shapes, with shelves and lips and sudden hollows scavel, her grandfather had called them. The kind of trap that looked like plain ground until your weight taught you its true depth. Anna cut the engine and listened again. White silence. She took a step, and the snow settled with a little whump as air squeezed out. She probed with a stick and found the edges, then worked a way down in slow zigzags, testing each shelf with the certainty of long practice. A scent reached her halfway down iron and something rank under it, like old rope. Jonas's face changed shape again. He smelled it too. "Snare," he said, the word flat. She found it on the next shelf, half buried by a fresh skin of drift. A loop of wires cinched tight around a narrow foreleg. The free end wrapped around a dwarf birch trunk until the bark had scored under it. The wolf lay on its side, sides pumping, lips cracked with cold, breath a small white engine. Its eyes were dull, not with fear, but with the exhaustion that comes after too much fear. The fur had rubbed raw where it had thrashed. Blood had frozen in a brown rosette around the wire, and then thawed, and then frozen again. For a heartbeat, the gully was too small to hold what Anne felt. Rage had a clean color to it in cold places. Hers flashed, and then banked under something more practical. Jonas slid down beside her on his hips, the way you do when you want your body to look small to a frightened animal. He did not reach for the wire cutters first. He reached into his pack and pulled out a blanket and a loop of soft line. He spoke in a low, even voice that did not try to soothe so much as occupy the air with non-threatening meaning. "We'll cover his head," he said to Anne, not taking his eyes from the wolf. "Then the cutters, if he thrashes, we give him space. If he goes for us, we roll away and let him have the snow." Anne nodded. Her hands had already found the cutters. She met the wolf's clouded gaze for a second, not as a challenge, not as pity, but as a naming. "We're here," she said. "Be still if you can." They moved when the wolf's sighs went down in the rhythm between breaths. Jonas threw the blanket in a single precise motion that turned the world into dim cloth and smell. The wolf's body surged once under it, then sagged. Strength had nowhere left to go. Jonas settled a soft loop behind the ears and tightened it just enough to steer the head away from their hands. Anne dug her gloved fingers into the snow until they met wire, found the twist that bit most, and set the cutters. The first snip didn't come. Ice had sealed the wire to the hair. She adjusted, breathed, and cut through a part of the loop that had less bite. The wire sprang like something released from spite rather than metal physics. The wolf jerked, and a low, awful sound came out of the blanket. Not a growl and not quite a cry. Easy, Jonas murmured. Easy, friend. Another? He kept the head steady with the loop, not choking, not forcing, only holding the motion in a channel. The second cut gave. The loop slackened. Blood, sluggish with cold, did not gush. That was good. Or it would be until feeling returned. Ani eased the wire away millimeter by millimeter, each hair that freed, leaving a clean wheel. When the wire fell into her palm, it felt heavier than a snare had any right to be. She threw it up onto the lip of the shelf with a flick of disgust. Booty, Jonas said, fishing in his pack. He passed her one of the tiny leather socks. Lanolin first. The tin was warm from his pocket. She scooped the clean, thick cream with 2 fingers and spread it gently across the torn pad and the raw groove the wire had left. The wolf flinched, but the flinch lacked energy. Jonas slid the booty up and tightened its little strap, hands steady in a way that made Anne understand how many broken things he had said in the field and how many of them had bitten at him anyway. When they pulled the blanket away, the wolf did not leap. It raised its head, blinked once in the too bright white, and let it thump back. Its breath still came quick. Its eyes, though, had sharpened by a notch. They weren't dull now. They were assessing. Anne licked her cracked lip. We need to move him. We'll use the pulk, Jonas said. You lead. I'll steady. The climb out of the gully turned into a small choreography. They eased the wolf onto the pulk, wrapped him with a reindeer hide tarp, and tied 2 lines across his ribs and hips, not tight, not trapping, just enough to keep the sled from spilling him when it lurched. Twice he made that small, humiliated sound animals make when they hate a thing that is saving them. Twice, Anne murmured nonsense in Sami that made the same shape in the air as lullabies. They reached the scooter as the first grains of snow stung the back of Anne's neck through the scarf. The horizon had vanished. Sky and ground were one blank. The squall hadn't waited for afternoon. It had come because it could. Go, Jonas said unnecessarily. He jumped onto the back of the scooter and angled the antenna like a sailor trimming a sail. I'll keep the receiver on in case the others move. If they break from the hut, they won't, Anne said, and did not know if she meant it as certainty or prayer. The return was a lesson in patience at the edge of panic. The world shrank to the faint tunnel the scooter's headlamp carved. The wind lifted snow from the surface and hurled it at their faces in veils that disintegrated just before impact. The pulk snagged once on a buried hummock and jerked sideways. Jonas was off the machine and at the line before the second jerk, hands sure and voice steady, and the sled came free with a hiss. The antenna crackled in his fist. Still weak, he called over the engine, but constant. The ones at your place, if the collars match, they're there. Good, she shouted against the wind that stole half her word. Good! The birch line appeared like ghosts resolving. Then the low hill. Then the small hunched outline of the Goati against the white. Before Anne had even cut the engine, before the silence after the engine's whine could widen and fall, the door skin stirred from within. A shape filled the gap, then another at its shoulder. 2 pairs of eyes shone like knocked coins. The injured wolf in the pulk lifted its head with an effort that looked like the last coin spent. It made a sound Anne had not heard from wolves before, a thin, questioning note, fragile as the edge of ice before it breaks. From the doorway, an answer came back, low and tremulous, layered with a history of winter and hunger and being animals together in a place that thinks nothing of either. Jonas's hand tightened on the pulk rope until his knuckles went white. He set it down carefully, as if setting down something that might shatter. Inside, Anna said, not sure if she spoke to wolves, to man, to weather, to the part of herself that had been waiting since the first knock. She reached for the tarp and the knot and the edge of the world. The wind caught its breath. The doorskin lifted another inch. And the three wolves, too, framed by the warm dark, one wrapped in hide and snow, and human intention, filled a small strip of space between storm and shelter with a sound that turned the cold to music. The Goati had never felt so small. As An and Jonas guided the pulk to the threshold, the injured wolf lifted its head, muzzle quivering beneath the tarp. A thin whine escaped it, trembling with recognition. From inside, the two wolves answered in overlapping tones, one deeper, protective, the other high and urgent. Anne unfastened the knots with fingers that burned from cold. The tarp peeled back, revealing the snared wolf's gaunt body. Its eyes fluttered open, finding the pair at the doorway. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the wolves spoke in their own wordless language. Short cries, throat-deep rumbles, soft clicks of jaws. Jonas froze, awed. "They know each other," he whispered. The larger wolf stepped forward, nose twitching, hackles bristled with conflict. Then, with a sudden collapse of tension, it lowered its head and touched the injured one's muzzle. A slow nuzzle, tender as a hand resting on a scar. The limping wolf, still bandaged, pressed close on the other side. Soon, the three formed a knot of fur, trembling, tails tucked yet wagging in tiny, almost embarrassed movements. Anne swallowed hard. The sound filling the Goati wasn't growling or howling, but something softer, a low chorus of reassurance, the sound of reunion after despair. It was family, stitched back together in her cabin. Jonas knelt slowly, laying the receiver aside. "You saved more than one life," he said, voice low with reverence. Anne didn't answer. She couldn't nigh. Her throat was too tight. Outside, the storm screamed against the rawhide walls, rattling the frame. Inside, heat pooled from the stove, wrapping around human and wolf alike. Yet tension crept back, carried not by the animals, but by the world beyond. It came first as the crunch of snow bootsteps, then a voice, muffled by wind. "Anne? Are you in there?" Her stomach dropped. It was Niels Ravna, cousin from the village, known for guarding the herd with a quick trigger and quicker temper. Jonas looked at her, reading the alarm on her face. "He can't know?" "He'll kill them," she whispered, "for the herd's sake, for pride." The wolves stiffened, ears pinned. The newly freed one let out a rasping growl, shallow but fierce. Anne raised both hands in calming gestures. "Shh, quiet." The door flap shook as Niels pushed it, but she held it firm. "What are you hiding?" he demanded. "I heard machines, voices. You're not alone." Jonas's jaw set. He reached for his pack, as if to shield the wolves. Anna stepped outside into the wind, forcing a smile. "A visitor, researcher from Tromsø. He was lost in the storm. I gave him shelter." Niels's eyes narrowed, and the noise I heard, the cries, Anne's heart hammered. "The wind," she said evenly. "It tricks the ears. Go home, Niels. Your reindeer need you." For a long moment, suspicion gnawed at his face, but the storm thickened, snow blinding. He spat to the side, muttered something about foolishness, and trudged back into the white. When Anne re-entered, Jonas let out a breath. That was close. She pressed her back against the door, trembling. Closer than he'll ever know. Hours passed. The reunited wolves lay entwined near the stove, dozing in fitful shifts. The injured one whimpered now and then, but each time its siblings nosed it gently, their bodies a barrier against fear. Jonas scribbled in a small notebook by lamplight, his face alive with thought. This bond, he murmured, is stronger than I dared hope. If they heal together, they'll stand a chance in the wild. An poured tea into 2 tin cups. Will you take them to your center? He hesitated. Yes, for treatment. But his gaze lingered on the wolves. They found something here, too. You. Anna shook her head. I only opened the door. That was enough. Toward dawn, the storm relented. Silence settled, thick and heavy. The wolves stirred, restless. They nosed the door skin, sniffing the pale light seeping through. They want to leave, Jonas said softly. No, Anne whispered. Not yet. They'd die out there. But she knew he was right. The pool of freedom beat louder than warmth or meat. Even broken, even hungry, wolves remember the wild, like humans remember their own names. Annie crouched beside them, her hand hovering inches from the injured one's muzzle. Not gods, not devils, she murmured. Just cold. Her palm brushed fur, brief, electric. A fragile miracle of trust. The wolf didn't flinch. Jonas's voice was steady. We move them tomorrow. My team will meet us with a truck. It's the only way. Anne nodded, though her chest ached. The thought of their absence hollowed the cabin already. For now, though, she stoked the fire higher, spreading light into every shadow. Wolves, man and woman sat together in uneasy peace, bound by a storm, by need, and by a thread of trust that felt as fragile and as luminous as the aurora itself. The storm had broken in the night, leaving the world glazed with silence. Snowdrifts glittered like hammered silver beneath the first pale wash of dawn. An pushed open the door of her goatee and breathed air so sharp it stung her teeth. For the first time in days, she heard no howl of wind, only the soft crack of settling ice. Behind her, the wolves stirred. 3 bodies pressed close on the blanket, their breathing synchronized as if their hearts had relearned one rhythm. The injured wolf lifted its head, blinking at the new light. Its siblings rose immediately, flanking her on either side. Even weakened, she was never alone. Jonas emerged with the receiver slung across his chest. His face was weary but bright with purpose. Dan and Ricky are on their way. They'll have a truck and proper crates. We meet them at the ridge. Anne nodded, though her chest tightened. The cabin had grown accustomed to their presence, their watchful eyes, the soft huffs of breath at night. To imagine it empty again was to imagine silence returning too heavy to bear. Together they rigged the sled. Jonas packed fresh bandages and a tin of lanolin. Anne lined the polk with furs. When the wolves approached, they did not resist. The injured one settled heavily, and the other 2 leapt in beside her without hesitation. Their eyes flicked between human and horizon, torn but trusting. The snow scooter growled to life. They set off across the tundra, the world dazzling and cruel in its beauty. Each breath crystallized in the air, hanging like ghost smoke. Ravens trailed them, curious shadows against the pale sky. By the time they reached the ridge, a shape waited a truck fitted with cages, exhaust puffing like a tired beast. 2 figures waved. Relief softened Jonas's posture. This is it, he said quietly. Anna crouched at the sled. She ran her gloved hand once more over the injured wolf's bandaged paw. The animal twitched but did not pull away. Her other hand hovered above the larger wolf's ruff, close enough to feel warmth. You came to me as ghosts, she murmured. You leave as family. Loading them was not easy. They balked at the strange metal crates, teeth flashing, hackles high. But with patience and Jonas's steady hands, Anne's calm voice, they entered one by one. The crates rattled shut. 3 pairs of eyes glowed through the mesh, watching her as though memorizing her face. Jonas rested a hand on her shoulder. You can visit. When they're healed, when they're strong again, we'll release them back into their territory. Maybe you'll be there. She nodded, blinking hard. I will. The truck's engine roared. Snow sprayed from its tires. As it pulled away, Anna stood in the dawnlight, watching until it vanished into the pale horizon. The silence that followed pressed against her ribs. Yet, it was not the same silence as before. It carried memory, the sound of claws on her doorstep, the warmth of bodies curled by her stove, the music of wolves reunited in her cabin. Back inside, the Goati felt larger, lonelier. The beads on the peg chimed faintly as she brushed past, a reminder of promises made. She stoked the stove, set the kettle on, and whispered into the empty air. May you run long. May you never knock on a door again. And outside, across the tundra, the first pale ribbon of aurora shimmered against the new morning, as if the sky itself remembered. If this story of compassion and survival touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a bond between humans and wild creatures that changed the way you see the world? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with friends who love powerful true-to-life stories, and hit subscribe so you won't miss the next tale, from the frozen tundra to the darkest forests. Until then, stay safe, stay kind, and remember, sometimes, a single act of trust can change everything.